Aquesta és la ponència inaugural i estem molt contents. Vull presentar-vos ràpidament a John Sheridan, que és el responsable digital dels Arxius Nacionals Anglesos. Estan fent un projecte molt interessant, canviant una mica la perspectiva que es té dels arxius i treballant en els serveis digitals i fent molta recerca en tecnologia. I avui ens ve a explicar això perquè al Congrés volem que tots sentim com una mica ens està canviant totes les xarxes socials, però també com la ciutadania s'està relacionant amb el govern i entre ells i com podrem gestionar tot això. I John ha estat treballant perquè té una formació en matemàtiques i en ciències de la informació, en tecnologia, i estan fent un bon treball que volem que sigui una mica un exemple per tots i que ens treguem una mica la por en enfrontar-nos a aquest món digital que ens està canviant tant. Sense més dilació, dono la benvinguda a John.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to check that you can hear me okay. Yeah? Good. So, I should say thank you for that introduction, and thank you to you for inviting me to your conference. Now, I'm going to rely a little bit on your help. If I speak too quickly, or if I'm not clear, then, okay, so call me out. I'm going to do my best to speak reasonably slowly and clearly so that you can follow and so that the translators have half a hope of translating on the topic of disruptive digital archiving. But sincerely, a big thank you for inviting me to this event. It's a great honor for me to have the chance to speak to you today. So, disruptive digital archiving. I want to first give you a little piece of context about the National Archives of the United Kingdom and its collection. So, for 1,000 years, the government has been collecting information about us to tax us and to govern us. As an archive of government, the role of the National Archives is to turn the tables. Whereas government collects information about us in order to govern us, the archive gives us all the opportunity to see the state, to see the government, to see how it's been going about its work, how it has been making decisions. It also gives us, I think uniquely, the opportunity to see what the state saw, to look through the government's eyes, through the records that the government has collected. It means that the archive is a fundamental part of the democratic infrastructure of our society, making the government accountable. But of course, it's also important for me to say that I am a government employee. I am a civil servant. So there's a balance there. Now, I'm going to let you in on a small secret. Archives for Everyone is the National Archives' new strategy. It's been agreed by our ministers, but as yet we haven't publicly launched this strategy. So It's okay if you tweet about this in Spanish or Catalan, I think I'll be okay, but not in English. Anyhow, the strategy has 3 themes. The first is around inclusion and trying to change the audiences that use our archive to amplify voices that are less well heard. The second is around entrepreneurship, and this is particularly about the archive doing more to grow its own income. And the third theme, which is the one that I wanted to talk about really today, is around disruption. And this speaks to the challenge of being a digital archive as well as a physical archive, and the challenge that we have in terms of developing new archival practice to meet the multi-faceted, complex, difficult, exciting, exhilarating world of digital records. Now, I need to work out which way to stand for the clicker to work. Let's point it that direction. So we find ourselves at a strategic inflection point. For my institution, that has been in the archiving business for 180 years, up until now, we've largely been preserving physical records, and we're still receiving paper records for us to preserve and make available in the archives. But from here on in, and for as far as we can see in the future, the new records that we are receiving are digital. We have moved from a world of tangible records to intangible records, and with it, almost everything about our practice has come under question. In summary, we face, as archivists and record managers, a bold choice. We can change what we do to meet the challenges that we have, or we can find ourselves being disrupted. Underneath our feet, the plate tectonics are shifting. The ground is not certain. So I'm going to explore this theme of disruptive digital archiving through 6 stories. And the first story is the children's story. And it's about the core, the emotional core of the archive and the archive's role. And I wanted to start by talking about something that amongst the disruption doesn't change. So, we have a program at the National Archives where we bring children into the archive and we introduce them to original records. Now, in the UK, every child aged 5 or 6 years old is told about the story of the Great Fire of London in the year 1666. And most of the city of London burnt down in that year. Now, there is no point when we bring groups of 5 and 6-year-old children, there's no point us teaching them about the Great Fire of London. They know it all already. So, we ask the children to tell us what they know. Now, the fire was in 1666. It started in a bakery. The baker was Thomas Fariner. He had an oven. The oven caught fire. The city was burnt down. And we capture the facts from the children. And then we ask them, how do you know? So, my teacher told me. My brother told me. My mother told me. Okay. but your teacher wasn't alive in 1666. They weren't there. So how does your teacher know? And these young minds, you can see it dawn on their faces. Oh, blimey. How does my teacher know that there was a fire in 1666 if they weren't alive then? Now, there's an element of theatre and drama to this. Imagine these poor young minds being faced with this existential crisis. How does anybody know anything? At this point of maximum doubt, we introduce them to the record. So this is a record that we have in the National Archives, and typical of records of government, it's to do with tax. And we taxed people based on the number of fires they had in their homes. And at the bottom you can see the name Thomas Fariner, and that he is a baker, and that he had 5 fires and 1 oven, and that he lived on Pudding Lane. It's an example of one of a number of records that we have about the Great Fire of London. Now, the children, even at age 5, when they see these records, there is just delight and joy. They cry out, "I know how we know," because they have seen the records that demonstrate it, that prove it. Now, this, I think, speaks to 2 fundamental values of the archive that, despite the digital disruption, will not change, and that we as archivists should cling on to. The first is that the archive is the place that answers the question, how do we know? The second is that there is joy in discovery, and that this, I think, speaks to the emotional core of no matter what it is that you're using an archive for, no matter what it is that you are researching. When you find something in an archival collection, you experience that joy in a way that even very young children can also experience. And these things are not disrupted by the challenge of digital records. Pretty much everything else is. So here goes. Next up, the theorist story. I want to reflect a little bit on the development of archival thinking over the last 100 years or so. Now, looking back, the first real effort to develop some archival theory was the Dutch manual in the late 19th century. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name beyond Theodore. My Dutch pronunciation is really not great. I still can't do it, but thank you. For those people near enough, you would have heard a great pronunciation. Now, this is where we start to develop our basic ideas about fonds, the importance of original order, the importance of managing arrangement, the importance of description. These ideas were further developed by our own Sir Hilary Jenkinson, who in 1922 wrote a manual of archive administration that really set the tone in terms of archival practice for the next 30 years. Now, coming from the UK National Archives, Jenkinson's archive, you can read his manual nearly 100 years later and see our practice and our approach still deep in the institution. We are still Jenkinson's archive. Now, if you track forwards, and 1922 is an interesting point in time, because the idea that there might be electronic computers was more or less unimaginable. We'd seen mechanical calculating machines, but we'd not seen anything at that point that you might imagine along the lines of a modern computer. However, by the time that the American archivist, and I hesitate to say this is not just about the Brits settling scores with the Americans, but by the time that Schellenberg writes his manual in the early 1950s, I will work out which way to point this thing. I'm going to try going back a little bit. By the time Schellenberg writes his manual in the 1950s, we had seen the first computers. It was clear that the world of information was going to be fundamentally different. And yet, Schellenberg places emphasis and weight on the archivist's worry about too much. Too much information is the thing that the archivist needs to avoid. Now, that's partly because for tangible records, the costs that the archive bears are indeed related to volume. But for intangible records, the world is quite different. Too much in terms of volume isn't really a problem for the archive anymore. Now, it's really interesting to think about what changed between 1922, when Jenkinson produced his Manual of Archives Administration, and Schellenberg in the late 1950s, when he wrote his manual, updating, if you like, the world of Jenkinsonian practice. And I think there were two fundamental ideas, the import of which we are still living through, that emerged between Jenkinson and Schellenberg. So the first is in 1945, Vannevar Bush writes an article in the American magazine, The Atlantic, entitled As We May Think. And he foresees, and this is just incredible foresight, he foresees a world in which machines will start to think and that people and machines will work together in a large information environment where we can explore information in all sorts of different ways. And he calls this imaginary machine the Memex. Now, Bush's work proved to be extraordinarily influential. It was Bush's ideas that inspired Ted Nelson, who invented hypertext in the 1970s, and later Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. Bush's conception of what kind of information world we might live in, though, didn't really influence archival thinking. And certainly not in the 1950s, although in 1945 he'd published his paper. The second real step change was a paper published in 1949 by Shannon. And this is something called information theory. And what Shannon is interested in is the theoretical basis for communication, particularly electronic communication. And in information theory, what Shannon arrives at is the idea that in order to safely communicate a message from one place to another, to avoid something that he calls information entropy, what you need is redundancy. You need to communicate more than just the information that you have in order to be able to verify that the information that you have sent has been fully received. In other words, you use redundancy in order to be sure that the information has been communicated successfully. Now, this is a really basic idea in information theory. Now, compare using redundancy to be sure that a message has been fully communicated with the archivist's worry of too much. Now, actually, in digital archives, we precisely use redundancy to make sure that our intangible digital records are preserved. We make several copies. We produce checksums so that we can verify that what we think we have is what we actually have. And this is the work of the digital archivist. The digital archivist is fundamentally engaged in making many copies and checking that those copies are the same. Not worrying about too much, but worrying about making more in order to be able to successfully communicate messages over time. We're not in Kansas anymore. The world of the intangible record is different. Now, the archival thinker David Bierman, by the time we get to the late 1980s, some of the tensions between traditional archival practice, not just in terms of preservation, but also around appraisal and selection and access, have become manifest. People can see that the practices that the archivists are pursuing are not well suited for the digital age. Now, Bierman writes, controversially, a paper in 1989 where he was really down on us all in a way, because what he says is that the traditional methods employed in archives for appraisal, description, preservation, and access to records fail to meet archival needs because the demands exceed the capacity of the profession and by more than an order of magnitude. And he advocates as a future radical post-custodialism, which, coming from a National Archives, looks a lot like giving up. Now, it's interesting because some of Bierman's criticism is right, but he was also profoundly wrong. And he was wrong because he too missed something amazing that also happened in 1989 that's had a profound impact on the work of archives. It's the same year that Tim Berners-Lee invents the World Wide Web. And with the World Wide Web, the archive has a new hope because suddenly we can reach new audiences rather than being confined just to people who come and use an archive through a paper catalogue in a reading room. We turn our catalogues into things that people can search and explore on the web. And the use of the archive, just the numbers of people who are working with our collections, expands beyond our wildest dreams, thanks to the World Wide Web and some of the opportunities that it's afforded the archive for relevance. Now, this is an example. Many archives, through digitizing our catalogues and providing search, have been able to expand their audience base. And this, I think, has been of extraordinary benefit to archives as we go about our work. Now, the third story, the digital archivist story. When I try to explain to people the difference between archiving tangible material and intangible records, particularly people who are not working in an archival background. I start with Magritte's delightful, playful, three-way contradiction around representation. So you have a representation of a pipe that is not a pipe. You have the words, this is not a pipe. A word representing the concept of a pipe, this too is not a pipe. And of course, an actual pipe. In the same way that the minutes of the meeting are not the meeting, the digital representation of the minutes are just a representation. We're managing a world of representations. But up to now, our approach to doing this has been to essentially simulate the approaches and practices that we designed for paper using computers. Most of our archival management systems are essentially paper process simulators in computerized form. And we're going to need to move beyond that if we are to deal with some of the challenges that are ahead of us. The good news is that archiving no longer involves large upfront capital investment. So you don't have to, if you are building a digital archive, you don't have to spend millions of euros on building yourself a large repository. In fact, one of the interesting characteristics of digital archiving is how the archive, which has been vertically integrated, so the archive does the storage, and it does the conservation, and it provides context, and provides access in a single vertically integrated unit, that vertical integration need no longer apply. Now, that's brilliant because it means that we can start doing meaningful archival work with very little in terms of resources. To make my point, last week I was able to demonstrate to some of the world's national archivists that you can start with digital preservation for €100 using just about the cheapest computer I could find, which is this is a thing called a Raspberry Pi, and using cloud-based storage. Now, I want to quickly share with you some reflections about why that is. So understanding how technology changes becomes very important to the work of the archive. Things that were once novel or difficult over time become cheap and easy. Technologies become commoditized. Now, that means that when we are making choices about what the archive does and what we just use or rely on other people to do on our behalf, we need to understand the shape of that. And one approach for thinking about technological change and archival value is to use something called Wardley mapping. Now, I've left a URL there. I'm not going to go too much into this, but I very briefly wanted to just reflect on this shift as problems become more known and more understood, our solutions to those problems become increasingly commoditized. Now, if you look at the prevailing model that we've had for almost 20 years for digital preservation, this is a thing called the Open Archival Information System, and you map these functional areas, so archival storage, data management, preservation planning, administration, onto a Wardley map, and you ask yourself, how are these things evolving, which is what these red lines are doing, you start to see something really striking. Look at this, archival storage. It's become a commodity. What does that mean? It means archival storage, rather than the millions of pounds for a physical repository, upfront capital investment. I could go to Amazon and buy myself robust archival storage for $1 per terabyte per month. Now, this poses some new questions for us, right? At $1 per terabyte per month, my boss says to me, well, you've quite a big tape library there, John. That looks reasonably expensive. Are you sure that you are turning our budget into the best mitigation of preservation risk? How important is it that the archive retains sovereignty over its data? Now, my answer to this would say, well, it really depends. It depends on what it is that you're preserving. It depends on how much money you have. And it depends on what your risk appetite is. But if you have very little money and you want to be in the digital archiving game, at $1, or more or less €1 per terabyte per month, that's a pretty good deal for the archive to get into the digital preservation business. But of course, as digital archivists, we're not just thinking about the relentless rise from Genesis to bespoke to product to commodity. We have to deal with the world going in reverse. I don't know whether many of you have tried buying horseshoes in London. I can tell you it was a damn sight easier to get yourself a horseshoe when they were commodities 100 years ago than it is buying a horseshoe today. We are dealing with, increasingly in digital archives, the informational equivalents of the horseshoes, records that are 30 years old, 1 or 2 generations of technology beyond what we're currently using today, and having to manage the risks. Now, reflecting on this, in the UK National Archives digital strategy, we framed our value proposition as an archive in traditional archival terms around preserving records, contextualizing records, presenting records, and enabling use for all types of record. It's the vertical integration that's changed. It's the decision-making process where the archivist is having to make fresh decisions about how we realize archival value with and for each generation of technological change. That is the disruption. Now, it means thinking about our work in a different way. The archive becomes much more what I would describe as a complex system. The resources that we use for going about archival work are not just changing much more rapidly. Sometimes those resources are commodity resources. Sometimes those resources are community resources. Some of the things we most depend on are things that archives together have made. We are, in a very deep sense, now dependent on each other, all of us in digital archiving, in a way in which we've never been before. And all of our success depends on each other to curate and manage the knowledge assets that we need to go about doing our work, to preserve records and to contextualize them. And I think conceiving of digital archiving through the lens of a complex system encompassing archives and other memory institutions, collaborating together within our regions, our countries, and around the world, is a very important notion for us to have and keep hold of. Because we're in the business of having to adapt to survive. Now, at the heart of the digital archiving business is the management of risk. It's about turning whatever resource that you have, and it could be next to nothing, you can still do meaningful digital archiving work, whatever resource that you have, into the most effective mitigation of the risks that you have. Now here I think that we all have work to do. Up to now, our approaches to understanding risk have been very based on having standards. What we've been less good at is measuring the risks that we have and responding to an empirical, measurement-based understanding of those risks. Now, I think this is one of the areas where we have work to do. Are those people in digital preservation who worry about something called fixity, computing over their collection to check that the records they have are the ones that they have, check the records they think they have are in fact the ones that they have? Is this worry around fixity, is that really the thing that is the best thing to spend your time and your energy and your money on in terms of mitigating risks to your collection? Would you do better by making another copy of all your records and not worrying about fixity? Or would you do better by emulating a piece of software so that a type of record that's currently hard to produce might be easier to produce in the future? How do you make those decisions? I think measurement is an important part of our archival practice going forwards. Another area is around authenticity. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen examples of videos like this. This is a video that was produced by BuzzFeed last year. It purports to be a video of President Barack Obama. But the words that are spoken are not Obama's words. It is a convincing fake. It's a form of content that we need to address ourselves to called synthetic content. We have just entered an era where any kind of information content that humans can create can be synthesized by computers in convincing ways. Not just video, but music, textual content. It can all, if not now, then certainly in the next 2 to 3 years, be synthesized. Authenticity is going to be an increasingly important part of the archive's work, and demonstrating the authenticity of the digital objects that we preserve is going to be an important part of how we add value in an era of increasingly pervasive synthetic content. We also need to address ourselves to questions around access. It's already clear to us that not all of the digital records that we have that are open are we going to be able to publish. The archive needs to navigate a complex information rights landscape, including intellectual property rights like copyright and database right, privacy rights, and rights of individuals not to be defamed. Now, how we manage to gradate access, providing controlled access to open records in order to manage our risks of producing a record, retaining the confidence of record creators on one hand, whilst providing appropriate access on the other, and weaving our way through in relation to our risk appetite around producing records, again, is an area where I think we have a lot more work to do as a community. The fourth story, the cataloger's story. Well, we were talking earlier about how storage becomes a commodity. I think context is and will be our superpower. Now, I have mixed feelings, I will confess, to the archival catalogue. I tend to think of it a little bit like a steam train. It's clearly taking 19th century technology to the limits of what could be done in the early part of the 20th century. The archival catalogue clearly functions. It looks amazing. People love it. And it's absolutely not what you would do today if you were setting about the business of providing context. Now, 2 thoughts about where I think we need to develop our practice around contextualizing records. The first, and this is borrowing from a book back in 1974 by Ted Nelson, who invented hypertext. He says everything is deeply intertwingled. People keep pretending they can make things hierarchical, categorizable, and sequential when they can't. Now, we had to bring a level of order to our physical collections in order to be able to exercise anything like intellectual control. Digital archiving and the use of digital archives is going to be quite different from that. You can imagine people much more using tools to explore the collection, more like kind of digital forensic, information seeking, finding individual things and connecting them, not working their way through the archivist's hierarchy. It means resisting the urge, and this is really tough to do, to retrofit order on chaotic information collections. If the record keeping is rotten, bring it into your catalogue anyway. Accept that your catalogue is going to get quite messed up by this digital stuff. And embrace the maybes. Some of the information that we most need and rely on, for example, dates of creation, we're going to have to accept and build into our archival practice that we just don't know the date for sure. Increasingly, as we use machine learning tools to compute over our collections for selection and to make decisions about access, we're going to run into probabilistic metadata, and we need to learn to cope. The 5th story, the machine story, well, a long time ago, and for most of my life now, I come to think of it, when you talked about artificial intelligence, you'd think of HAL. And in the last decade, suddenly, we now have Alexa or Siri, or we are continually being augmented by machines. Now, underneath this has been the rise and rise of the transistor, from valve to transistor to microchip. You can have 100 million transistors on a millimeter by millimeter portion of a silicon microchip. This growth in computing power suddenly has given us an era alongside pervasive data where computers can do things that they just couldn't do even 5 years or 10 years ago. For archivists, I think it's about taking advantage of the possibility, understanding those things that machine learning systems are able to do well, for example, helping us choose or select between personal email and business email with some degree of accuracy, and understanding those things that today's artificial intelligence solutions are not going to be so good at, contextual awareness or empathy. But a vision of the archive where the archive user is assisted by machines, where some of the mediation that the archivist has traditionally provided is now through an artificial intelligence, and that we develop new tools using artificial intelligence, and we develop archival practices to appraise and select and preserve and contextualize the AIs, because when these things are making decisions, they are records too. This is work for the digital archivist, work for the future for us to do. Just now, I don't think anyone knows how you appraise, select, preserve, or present an artificial intelligence deep network. We've work to do to figure some of that out. Lastly, the historian's story. Because alongside this disruption, history is still going to be incredibly important. Us human beings are going to want to understand where we have come from, how we got here. The love affair that many people have with history, that's going to continue. But our methods are going to shift. We're starting to see history and historical research become something that looks a little bit more like a data science. It's early days still, but people working in digital humanities are developing new methods, and the archive and the archivist needs to respond to the changing nature of historical research. To sum up then, digital disruption is our new core business. We need to reconcile ourselves to it. The good news is that the bar for getting started is really low. It's very exciting for all of us, and it's a team sport. There's no archive on the planet that is close to being big enough or smart enough or capable enough to solve all of these problems on its own. It means that we as archivists have to get really good at sharing what we know and working together. The fundamentals, though, that the archive is still the place that answers the question, how do we know? And that there will be joy in discovery, those things we can cling on to as our certain points whilst we transform, adapt, evolve, change in this exciting new digital era. My thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Anem una mica justos, però crec que ha valgut la pena i que tots tindreu ara moltes preguntes i molts dubtes i moltes ganes de posar-vos a treballar en canviar el món dels arxius. I encara que anem una mica justos, hi haurà temps per un parell de preguntes. Algú vol fer alguna pregunta? Do you have any questions for Jon? Hola. Algú? Vinga, que algú s'animi. Vinga, aquí tenim una pregunta del Christian. El micro, sisplau.
I'll repeat the question, but yeah, go on. So the question was, could I explain something about the project Archangel? So very briefly, Archangel is a research project that the National Archives is doing with a university in the UK, at the University of Surrey, and the Institute of Open Data in the UK, the Open Data Institute. And we are worried about this problem of demonstrating the authenticity of digital records that we hold in the archive closed for a long period of time. And we're researching how we might use a distributed ledger, or maybe it's often more commonly called a blockchain, where we can take the hashes, these kind of, you take your record and you compute a number that represents that record that you can use to verify it. And we put those numbers onto a distributed ledger where archives are all collaborating together to keep this ledger. Now, we've come up with a working prototype for how this works. We're particularly worried about how we can prove cryptographically the authenticity of the records we hold in the archive in a way that you don't just have to take our word for it. And we're particularly worried about records that we are keeping for a long period of time closed. we're also experimenting with whether we can create these hashes, is what they're called, that represent the intrinsic informational content of a record, not just the sequence of noughts and ones in its encoding. So we've been experimenting and researching something called content hashing, particularly looking at video. And what we're really trying to do here is take some of the approaches that are being used for creating synthetic content and seeing how we can use the same methods to assure genuine content. It's a research project. We've got some working software, so if anybody wants to try it, we're running a trial at the moment. Just email me or let me know, and we can get you up and running. Again, it's very cheap and easy to get involved with. So if it is something that you want to experiment with and see and try, then shout and we can let you experience what we're doing with the Archangel project.
¿Alguna pregunta més? Algú li hauria... ja, tenim una pregunta. Li podeu passar el micro, allà al fons?
Tal com ha dit, no es pot plantejar la preservació digital des d'una única institució o un únic arxiu. Llavors, com es planteja la preservació digital al Regne Unit? Si es planteja com una xarxa d'institucions connectada o bé quin rol hi juga l'Arxiu Nacional precisament en el suport a la preservació digital.
Can you make the question in English or you want to translate the question?
I'm not sure if I am prepared to ask in English, but as you said, the digital preservation for a single archive is very difficult. So how the digital preservation is planned for all local councils or municipalities, for example, in the United Kingdom, and if it is planned as a network, and what is the role of the National Archives in supporting these tasks? Thank you.
Okay. So in the UK, the National Archives, because of us, we are by a mile the biggest archive in the country. The other archives look at what we're doing in digital and they're all like, whoa, how the hell are we supposed to do that? And generally, the approach to digital archiving, we have some really big challenges in our archival sector. Most archivists do not have digital skills, and they feel very nervous, very scared about what it means to become a digital archive. We have a role in terms of leading the sector. What we've seen is when local archives come together, they can get a critical mass of knowledge. And by this I mean, rather than one person working on their own, 4 or 5 people working together. I don't mean hundreds of people or tens of people, quite small groups of people. And with a moderate budget, they can, many times using a commercial digital preservation system. There's a system that's run by a UK company called Preservica. It's quite expensive, but local archives have adopted that and that can work. Or some open source solutions. There's a thing called Archivematica. There's also a bunch of tools that have been developed around eArch. And they've got those things running in some pockets. And the pattern normally is a relatively small group of enthusiasts get together. Our role as the National Archives is twofold. The first is around capability building, and that means working with the community to help develop the skills of archivists throughout the UK, and particularly putting emphasis on digital skills. Now, and we're very fortunate we have an organisation called the Digital Preservation Coalition that has a strong base in the UK, and that means that there's quite a lot of events and quite a lot of materials that, that archivists can use. I think at TNA, we still think that the bar is being set too high, and one of the things that we're trying to do, particularly in terms of the amount that you have to spend to show how you can make progress, spending very little money, because we would rather that archives and archivists just try doing something, however basic, than not try at all. The second, the second area of work, as well as digital capacity building, is how we see our own role. So this year, we're setting out to become a teaching archive, looking at the idea that you see, for example, with hospitals, where you have a big hospital where people who want to learn and get hands-on experience in treating people, you go to a teaching hospital and you learn how to do it. We have the same conception for our work as an archive, where people can come to the National Archives and maybe spend 1 day a week over a 10-week period with getting some hands-on practical experience with digital archiving in a trained course with homework. And we'll even give you a computer to work with as well, so people can really get that sense of, it's not all mysterious, but I have the opportunity to do real digital archiving work in a real setting that I can then bring back into my local archive. So skills and capability and training amongst a community and digital capacity building, very much part of our mission, and then practically trying to transform ourselves into a teaching archive as being the best contribution we can make as the UK's National Archive.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, John. I donem per acabada la sessió. Moltes gràcies a tots.